Welcome to Tales from the Fandom, a podcast that brings a special guest out of the multiverse and straight to you. And now your host, David Ginsburg.
Welcome to a very special edition of Tales from the Fandom. Today is the 50th anniversary of Star Trek gracing us with its presence. It's a cultural phenomenon that has been ongoing since it debuted in 1966. Now it's 2016. We've had a space shuttle named after the Enterprise. We've had TV shows, movies. Star Trek was one of those first fandoms that got a lot of people not only going out to conventions, but dressing up, learning Klingon, taking Klingon in college. And today I am joined by an original guest of mine, Chelsea Doyle. You may have heard her episode 6, where we discussed a number of different fandoms, but I knew the person I had to reach out to talk about Star Trek was Chelsea. So welcome back for this special edition of Tales from the Fandom.
Thank you for having me back. You know, there's nothing I like talking about more than Star Trek.
Absolutely. And I know we were talking earlier, getting this set up, and Star Trek for me is one of those first fandoms that I can remember clearly. Like, one of my best friends took me to the movie theater to see Star Trek 6, and I was instantly hooked to the point of going back and watching all the movies. Next Generation was on at that time, getting into Next Gen, watching the old series, watching everything that came out afterwards, with the exception of Enterprise.
Yes, of course. I remember seeing 6 in the theaters as well. And my dad had the first movies on Betamax. That's how long ago it was.
Now, for those of you who are listening, Betamax was a competitor to videotapes.
It was before videotapes, but then VCR totally destroyed everything. So my dad we had a Betamax and then a VCR and then so on and so forth. But I remember the Betamax very clearly. So he had me watch the older movies, but we actually did watch the show. We watched The Next Generation. That was in '87. And my dad liked to watch it himself. And then, of course, I was only very little when this was going on. So I saw the end seasons of The Next Generation and the movies. But like I said, in the past one, Voyager was the only Star Trek that I watched from the premiere to the finale. And so that does have a special place in my heart. But I started with the shows before the movie. So I knew the shows really well.
Right. And as I said, I started with Undiscovered Country, which I fell in love with. I think that's where it solidified my love of Sulu as a captain.
Yes.
Because, I mean, he's got the Excelsior. I mean, that's one awesome ship at the time.
Yeah, he was pretty great.
So let's talk about how it meant for you to be growing up as a Star Trek fan.
Well, I grew up in small town Maine, so there were no people that liked Star Trek but me, and definitely not at my tiny school. And if I talked about it, people looked at me blankly. This was people who barely knew what Star Wars was, so it was definitely not the kind of people you talk to about science fiction. So I mostly had my father to talk about, and we owned a comic book store, so there were a lot of nerds that would come in there, and so I was able to talk to them about Star Trek, but not a lot of people my age there was into it. So it actually was the internet that got me talking to other people for the first time, with people my own age who loved it. But It's always been strange. It's always been hard being a female geek, because there were definitely, I could talk to guys all day about this stuff, and I knew a lot of men who could talk to me about it, but I actually didn't know a lot of Trekkie girls until I was older. And I feel like I had this conversation literally like 2 weeks ago. I was sitting down with these two women that I knew fairly well, and we had never talked about Star Trek. And it turns out all three of us love Star Trek, and we never realized it. And so we all got very excited and ignored everyone else and just talked about Star Trek. And possibly because none of us had really gotten a chance to talk to anyone about Star Trek like that. So that was really fun.
Absolutely. I remember when I got into Star Trek, I was really one of the only people in my high school that was into it at the time. And then I found on Prodigy there used to be like Star Trek role playing
Yes, of
groups
course.
where you got to apply, and then they assigned you a ship and a position, and you kind of like typed up what your character is doing, and you could get transferred to different starships, and each starship was different. And then I found the actual like fan club that met at the local mall once a month.
Oh my goodness, I wish we had something like that. That would have
It,
been
it was
amazing.
it was insane. Like we got to volunteer for the conventions that came to our
Ah,
very, very small, Panama City is not a big town in Florida, but we did eventually arrange like Star Trek conventions.
that's so
Uh,
nice.
it was, and that was my first experience with conventions as a whole, or seeing how many people are out there that love the same thing that you do. And
Exactly. And then it's just if they like one thing, then you just know there's going to be other things that you're going to connect about. It always is that way. You might get one thing in common and then you start talking and you find out you have 10 things in common.
absolutely. And one of the things that always got me, because as you're talking about like finding girls that are into Star Trek, is that I remember that convention, the first one, there weren't a lot that were dressed in Starfleet uniforms, but there were a heck of a lot of women as Klingons.
Yes, I'm not surprised to hear that. Actually, the Trekkies were, I mean, it makes sense. The Trekkies were very varied in who watched it, with ages, with genders, with races. People always, I mean, the original series, remember that they had Sulu and they had Uhura and they had all these characters. And at that point, I remember the story about Uhura was that she was the first black woman on TV not to play a maid or a servant of some kind. She was
Hmm.
a Starfleet, she was an officer, and she thought it was just everyone's minds were blown. And Whoopi Goldberg told that great story about how she was amazed that there was this black woman on the screen, and that's why years later she was on the show and she never got any money for it. She was on the show for free because it meant so much to her and it got her into acting. And
Hmm.
so, it was always very innovative, and obviously we know that Roddenberry, though having some very big issues, he was a very progressive person. So I'm not that surprised that the fandom reflected that mindset.
Absolutely. I was going to bring up that story that Whoopi Goldberg told,
Hmm.
because I remember seeing it floating around a couple weeks ago.
It was floating around because of Leslie Jones. So Leslie Jones, who was in the new Ghostbusters, she was on The View or with Whoopi Goldberg, and she told her that when she saw Whoopi Goldberg in things in The Color Purple and all these stuff, that's what made her want to be an actress. And a comedian was Whoopi Goldberg. So it was like different generations all being inspired. So when Leslie Jones said that, everyone's like, oh, remember how Whoopi Goldberg said that? And like, it was just it just is one of those things that just proves how important representation is. And when people are always like, oh, what does it really matter if we cast women or people of color in these roles? Well, that's why it matters right there, right there. If one person is influenced to become something they didn't expect, or to feel a certain way that they wouldn't have before, like that's completely worth it. That's what we should be striving for as a creative force.
Exactly. And especially now with the new show that's coming out, and they announced, I'm not sure if we talked about it on the last episode that I had you on, but now that they've announced that the primary focus is once again on a female lead, which is
Yay!
fantastic. And I know I was just reading the report today or yesterday that she's going to be called number one,
Oh
for the most
yes.
part, as a throwback to Majel Barrett Roddenberry on the original series, and then they're going to eventually release her name through the show at some point.
Yes, because they said she wouldn't be the captain, but it looks like she might be the number one, the second in
Right.
command.
Yep.
So that would kind of be interesting. I actually like the idea of it being through the eyes of the second in command rather than the captain. Like that would be interesting. Because, obviously Spock is a beloved character and people liked Riker as well, but, the captain is the main role. So the idea of it actually being through the perception of somebody who isn't the captain, I think that would be a really interesting storyline. And maybe she
Yeah,
becomes the captain. We don't know.
absolutely. And I know that with Next Generation followed by Deep Space Nine and Voyager, you did get those character stories with the ensigns or
Yes,
the
definitely.
engineers, but again, it was primarily, Picard's captaincy or Cisco or Janeway
Yeah.
as the primary, and it's definitely going to be interesting because of that they're setting it in the time period prior to Kirk's 5-year
I
mission.
know. Wow. I think it kind of makes sense though. They feel like, I guess you could do a future, but I think it's good to start it earlier because, I mean, we know that before that, it was a much more tumultuous period, and that could be very interesting to show, especially if they want more action-driven things, which let's face it, most people do. Then a period of time before that could be maybe when the Federation is first getting its legs under it or is getting stronger and having more alien races sign on. Like, they definitely have some good opportunity there. I mean, the future could be interesting too, but it'd just be more of the same. The Federation's bigger. There's more aliens. What do they have to explore?
Exactly.
And so is kind of like, nope, we're going to backtrack way before that. So I'm very excited about it. I think they're going to have fun. I think they're a lot better now at making the entire cast interesting. I mean, I love Star Trek, the original series, and I like every single person, but a lot of them didn't get like real roles until later in the season or in some of the movies where I feel
Hmm.
like with each show, it got more and more about the entire cast, and maybe Picard was the main character, maybe Janeway was, but like I felt like all the characters got storylines, they got personalities, they had love stories, they had all this stuff. So I think with every show, they've gotten better about making it an ensemble and not just, uh, Kirk and Spock, really. And they really thought it would just be Kirk. And then Spock became such a big fan favorite that it became their show.
Hmm. Definitely. What does Star Trek mean to you now? Like, I mean, growing up with it, it played a huge role in your life, my life. What's it mean to you now?
It means, I mean, it's such a nostalgic thing, but what I would like to see from Star Trek, so Star Trek to me was always what I said, innovative, progressive, different, unique, thoughtful, and it was always taking on big questions, and maybe it didn't do it correctly, or they were definitely attempting some things that didn't work out, but they definitely were always attempting to put deep thought because science fiction is about thought. You have to be creative, you have to think outside the box, but relate it to modern day emotions. So I think that's what I feel about it now. That's what I want to see from the new show and from whatever they do from now because while I'm fine with the new movies and I really like the current one, I just feel like it's been lacking that kind of introverted thinking process like this is really about community and society and humanity down to our deepest parts. And I always thought that Star Trek was very important that way. And you look at, I love Star Wars too, but people compare the two all the time. And I love Star Wars, but Star Wars is an adventure. Like that doesn't need to get super deep. It does at times, but those are movies. The Clone Wars get into some more deep stuff, but generally I look at that as like this is a fun romp with some emotions, but like I want deep thought from Star Trek. I want to walk away thinking about something and wondering about things. And so that's kind of how I pictured it then and what I'd like to see from it now. I want to get back that wonder. I want them to ask big questions, even if they're going to fail.
Let's hope that they don't, because we have gone far too long without a Star Trek series on TV.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that they're gonna fall into the trap of most TV right now, and they're not gonna, they want to cater to the common denominator, which I don't blame them for because you want good ratings. I understand that entirely, but at the same time, I believe that telling good stories and hooking people, an audience could happen. I think that both can happen. Game of Thrones has proven that both can happen. It's
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like Star Trek can do the same. It's going to start out with a lot of interest. All they've got to do is hook them and keep them, because it's going to start out. I mean, the first episode is going to have amazing viewership. All they have to do is try their best to put enough of a kernel of interest that people will stick with it. But I do hope they remember that it's supposed to be a thoughtful, thought-provoking, hopeful, optimistic kind of show.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing I always loved about Star Trek is it really believed heavily in the good of humanity and the good of people, and not just humans. I mean, all the species, they always really believed that they could make a better world and that we were in a better future because people believed in it. So I kind of would like to see that as well.
Now, we were talking on your previous episode, and we had hit on the fact that the Star Trek series, this one is going to be much shorter than a regular season. It's going to be like the 13 episodes, I believe.
Yes, good idea.
And I have to say, I think that's going to help it a lot because they're going to have to be just really tight on their storytelling.
Exactly.
And that first episode is definitely going to be that make or break episode for a lot of people.
I agree. And, I was actually thinking of this really recently because I've been rewatching Leverage, as I might have mentioned, and I love that show. And one of the things I loved about the show is it's half a normal season. They're always short, they're always to the point. And the same thing with all the Daredevil shows on Netflix and HBO. They're smart. They understand that everyone hates filler. Everyone does. Viewers don't like filler. The cast and crew don't like filler. No one wants the filler. So it's only people are padding it because they need to do a full season. And that's what we've all been trained. You have to do the 22 episodes. But every show would be better if they cut it down because you know what the meat is. And you know when you're in an episode that is really good and means something. And you know when you're watching an episode that nothing matters. And it gets very frustrating when you're trying to do both at the same time. So I'd like all shows to be 13 episodes.
Now, you have a story, well, because we're getting everything set up for today, and you accidentally met the entire Next Generation cast, all of them.
I met most of them. Patrick Stewart was not there, but this is the weirdest. So this is a weird story. So they were all signing things later. I was at Comic-Con. This was like 6 years ago. And I was at Comic-Con and they were signing later and I didn't want to get in that giant line. So I was actually just walking through the convention and it must have been like a Star Trek store. So it wasn't like randomly them all hanging out, but they were all hanging out at the store. And they were all just sitting like right in plain sight, sitting and talking and having coffee. And I was so shocked that they weren't being swarmed, although I assumed that people didn't look because they weren't thinking, oh, there's the entire Star Trek Next Generation people sitting together. What the heck? So I went over there because I couldn't believe it. And there was no one around. I mean, there were people around me and no one was looking. I just didn't even know what to think about this. So I went over and I talked to them for a while and they were so great. And they were so nice, which is what I think is really important about specifically science fiction actors, because I did entertainment journalism for a while, and I could tell you that most science fiction actors are just generally nice and appreciative, like without fail, because they know that their fans are like the smaller fan bases that are very fervid and they love it. And there's something about the science fiction actors that draws in these positive people who actually care about what they're doing. And it shows because they just really comfortably started talking to me. And I joked that Marina Sirtis is one of my dad's big crushes. So she had a Deanna Troy and she was right there and she was talking to me and I got a picture from her. and I had her sign it for my father, and she was laughing, and then we started talking about gargoyles of all things because she did a voice. Several of the next generation did a voice for gargoyles. It was insane. It was Jonathan Frakes, Deanna Troy, and then if I remember, Brent Spiner did
Mm-hmm.
as well. So she's like, oh yeah, we were all on that. So that was a random conversation, but it was great. I mean, they were just so warm. They had no problem with me just walking over and and talking to them, even though they were clearly like just hanging out and not really interacting with people yet. But it was quite a fun experience. And I've met so many crews. I met the Firefly crews and all that stuff, and they're just nice people. They all care. They all want to hear your stories. They want to be fun. And I talked to Nathan Fillion about Halo for 15 to 20 minutes. He was so enthusiastic. So, I mean, I just think science fiction actors are some of the nicest and most approachable people you ever meet.
Now let's talk about what Star Trek set as a precedent for the rest of the science fiction community out there. Like, without Star Trek, can you imagine shows like Firefly
No.
or Battlestar Galactica was out, I think, at the same time as Star Trek. I could be wrong, but
I don't remember. Oh, 1978. So actually, no.
okay.
So
Well,
Star Trek was first.
so you have these shows that follow in the footsteps of Star Trek, and honestly, I can't imagine that we would be where we are either in fandom in general or science fiction in general without Roddenberry's contribution with Star Trek.
No, it definitely, I mean, Trekkies are legendary. They were the first rampant, intense fan base that people just had to talk about. This was before message boards and everything, and people still all knew what Trekkies were. Like these people who loved it so much that it was that important to them, and their fandom, I mean, spawned I think it was the fandom really. I mean, the show was amazing, but it would have never gone into the level it did without that adoring fandom and the loudness of them and the aggression of them to remember that this was something special. And I think that science fiction ends up becoming that passion project for a lot of people, like that little engine that could kind of thing. You know, you feel like science fiction just goes in as the small guy because it never gets nominated for Emmys or Golden Globes. Science
Mm-hmm.
fiction's mostly ignored in all like the big acting categories, even though we'd all have to admit they're excellent actors and they do great stories, but it's still kind of ignored. So, as a fan of that, you go into it knowing like this is like a cult classic. Not everyone's watching this. We have to make everyone watch this. So I do think that, I mean, without its popularity, because it got canceled in 3 years, but it was the loudness of the fans and the how it changed that time of people thought about television and what adventures they could see. It just made it big enough that they got a movie, and then they continued, and they'd never really seen anything like that before. And the attention of the fans that loved it is really what pushed it to legendary status, and that's why everyone tries to. With all science fiction is now like just trying to gain that love for Star Trek.
What's funny to me is when I was growing up, we're all both the same age or close enough, that the things presented in Star Trek, whether it was the original series or Next Generation specifically, you look at that technology and it's here.
It is.
Like, I mean, between the Bluetooth earpieces or the iPads or iPhones.
Yeah, all the smartphones, and I feel like there has to be some of those tech people who got the ideas. Like, let's make this a reality. I'm still waiting on teleporters.
That is one thing that I wish teleporters or like shuttlecraft, man.
Yeah, or the food that you put in the thing and it's like a pea and then it turns into a full meal. That would be good too. So, I mean, but I wouldn't be surprised if people are looking for it because of that show. And I mean, I'm not going to say the Star Trek is the first it is, because we had some incredible science fiction that started before then and talked about all this technology and the importance and sometimes the dangers of technology, let's not lie.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I mean, that brought it to the public eye and the popularity. And Star Trek's just really incredible. And I think people forget just how amazing what happened was, because it was so long ago, and they don't understand like the atmosphere of the 60s and the difference in a pre-internet and technology world. And there were just so many things about it that are amazing, but now it's kind of like, oh yeah, I get it. I get it. You're like, no, you don't get it. It was amazing. You don't understand. This never happens. This is lightning in a bottle. This is the thing that people want to happen, and they try to replicate it 100,000 times, and only once in a while, like a firefly happens, you know?
Absolutely. Now, just to end it,
Okay.
because I want to just ask, what do you see for Star Trek in the next 50 years?
Oh, I hope it just is always around in one form or the other. I really hope this show does well and that they keep going for a while, and then I hope they get a whole new cast and just continue for a while. And then of course if the TV show gets popular enough, they'll probably make movies of that cast. Not that
Mm-hmm.
like I said, not that I have a huge problem with the current movies, but I really miss the depth that we had with the characters that we'd seen for years and years on
Right.
adventures. Like there's just something you can't replace about I've watched Picard for 3 years and all these adventures, and now I'm watching him fight the Borg, and it's so much more emotional than, oh, I've seen like 2 hours of this person. I don't really have an emotion that much attached to them. So I think 50 years from now, I think it'll still exist. I think it'll have some form and people will still talk about it, and it'll still be known. I just hope that it doesn't lose itself in obscurity like it did for a while there, because the world needs Star Trek.
Right, because it did disappear for a while, and then it
Yeah.
had the resurgence with Next Generation, which thankfully they crossed that first season
Yeah.
hump that they had, and
And then
established it.
after Enterprise, it died again for a little while before the movies. So I respect that the movies rebooted and brought it back to the attention. But like the Star Trek is better as a TV show than a movie, because
Mm-hmm.
they need many many episodes to get you emotionally involved. And I
Absolutely.
definitely want. So I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on Star Trek? What are the things that you love most about it and hope to see in the future?
I would love to see multiple seasons and iterations on TV. I know growing up as a preteen or teenager that Star Trek was one of those things that really brought me out or brought me to the friends that I still have to this day. And I'd love for my kids to be able to have that like that same experience of going to their first conventions,
Oh.
um, as like having Star Trek under their belt or being able to sit up and watch Star Trek. I've been able to, like, thankfully BBC America shows Star Trek Next Generation a lot. So I've sat down with them on just some episodes that have been on the air and just been able to watch it with them. And I think that's what I want the most, is to have new generations being able to watch it on TV.
Yeah, and luckily it's all on Netflix now too. So there are more audiences that all of it, everything of Star Trek. So I
Hmm.
think what Star Trek is, so whenever I think about science fiction, it's like, yeah, it's futuristic and there's aliens and there's technology, but I think it's just always about humanity. It's always about who we are and what we want to be. And I think that's why it resonates year after year, and why science fiction is the most interesting, because it's so distant from us. Science fiction is the future and it's so distant, but it isn't. It's so personal. And everything they do is, you just can't help but feel like, yes, this resonates and is personal to me. And I find that it's a very interesting genre that way, because you would think that it would be as far removed as you as possible, but it's the opposite. It is you, you know?
Definitely, definitely. I think the other thing that I want for it is a good caretaker. I
Oh,
want
God, yes.
that person. And I know the person that's doing it now, I believe they were, I can't recall
Is it
if they're.
Brian Fuller?
Yes, I'm pretty sure it is.
I'm pretty sure it is, yes, which
And
would be amazing. I mean, he's great, so.
right. The only other thing I could see is if like Jonathan Frakes was like, I'm going to run the show for the next 30 years.
That would be so amazing.
I just want someone who will take the vision that is Star Trek and make sure it's going in the right direction and not devolve or just go down to that lowest common denominator route and just stick to what they are supposed to be doing with the show.
I agree. I think Brian Fuller is a great choice for that because he is someone who I trust to care about the story and care about meaning something than about actually making the kind of show that everyone wants. Because, I mean, to be honest, his most famous 4 shows all were canceled. And I loved them. They were all critically acclaimed. They were amazing. They were smart. They were beautiful. They were well written. And then they just couldn't get the audience. But I'm really hoping that this will work. But he actually wrote for Voyager and Deep Space Nine.
Okay.
He I think it was like 20 some episodes that he did. So he actually has a lot of background with Star Trek. And Alex Kurtzman, who is the other co-runner, he did Fringe. He co-created Fringe, and he did Alias, and he did the new Star Trek. He was one of the producers for the newest movie, and he did Xena and Hercules. So these are real nerds here we're dealing with. So I have some hopes.
I'm glad that there's the people behind it that are, they've got that, they know what they're getgetting into.
Yeah, and they love it. I mean, these are people that probably are more like us than not like us.
Right.
So I have high hopes for the two of them. I think that they are the kind of people. I think that Brian Fuller in particular, his personal story, I mean, he did Hannibal, which is great, and he pushed so many envelopes with that, and Pushing Daisies, which was one of the most visually beautiful things I've ever seen. Like, that show visually is unlike anything you've ever seen. So I think that he cares, and he'll put a lot of good stuff in there. So I have faith in the two of them. I would love Jonathan Frakes to be a part of it, though.
Yeah, he always seems to get in there somewhere, somehow.
He should, because he's amazing. And he obviously, as you know, did all of Leverage. So I have feelings about that. But I think it would be great to have him back, and I feel like everyone wants a piece of Star Trek. Sorry, I think everyone wants a piece of it, so we might get some really good stuff going for these guys.
Well, let's hope.
Yes,
let's hope. And to another 50 years.
Here's to another 50 years. I think it'll happen.
I think so too. I'll make sure I'll put it in my calendar 50 years from now.
And your child, you'll have to be like, listen, you have to make this live.
That's right.
We have to give it to the next generation.
The next generation.
Next generation.
Well, Chelsea, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to me on this 50th anniversary day of Star Trek. Everyone who's listening, go out there, hit up Netflix, watch an episode.
Absolutely. Watch all of it. Tell everyone.
And just make sure that no one catches you drinking any Romulan ale. All right. Thanks a lot, Chelsea.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fandom. Subscribe to us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Tales from the Fandom to see photos, links, leave feedback, and check out upcoming guests. If you'd like to be a guest, email David at talesfromthefandom@gmail.com.